When I died at the age of 33, I died with a lifetime of secrets and shame that went with me. Things that I had never told anybody, especially the sexual abuse that I endured as a child from the ages of 3 to 12. I always thought, if he's real, I've got some questions for him. What kind of God are you? Where are you? How do you love a child? And watch that kind of abuse happen. When I died and when I found myself in this beautiful light with angels standing to my left and the presence of God to my right, and I turned to face him, I fell straight to my knees and then went straight to my face. And I cried because he touched me, knowing who I was and who I had been. And he wrapped this love around me. And I put my hands up and I said, why?
One of the most challenging accusations that atheists and skeptics level against God is, God, if you claim to be this loving Father who is all powerful, and you claim we're your children and you love us, how in the world could you allow so much evil and suffering for your children? Well, if you've ever asked that question, today you're going to hear a very interesting answer from Crystal McVea, who I interviewed, who grew up with a tremendous amount of abuse in her life. And then she got to ask God that very question during her near-death experience. Well, I'm John Burke, and this is the Imagine Heaven live series. I'm doing this in between seasons of the Imagine Heaven podcast, which is based on my New York Times bestselling book, Imagine Heaven. And so if you haven't watched the episode 1 through 10 of the Imagine Heaven podcast, I hope you'll go back and do that. But in between seasons, I wanted to let you hear from some of my past live interviews that I've done, the full interview. And like I said, today, I'm interviewing Crystal McVea. She's a school teacher in Oklahoma, grew up with a tremendous amount of evil done to her. And, I'll tell you, being a pastor for so many years and watching what people can do to other people, and especially little kids, and it breaks your heart and it makes you wonder, God, where are you? What are you doing? And she always wanted to ask God that question. And then during her near-death experience, she had a chance. Listen to what she discovered. Crystal, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's nice to see you again.
I see your teacher board behind you. So you're still teaching, huh?
I teach English to students all over the world.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, why don't you start in just giving us a little of the background of your story, because I think it's really important in setting up really why you had that question for God.
Sure. So I was born and raised in a small town in southwest Oklahoma. The question wasn't, do you go to church? It was, what church do you go to? And at 8 years old, I heard the altar call, and I was down at the front before the pastor could even finish. And at 8 years old, the words that caught my attention were, if you accept Jesus, he will save you. And what nobody knew at that time, and what nobody would know until I was well into my 30s, was that what I needed Jesus to save me from was years of sexual abuse that I had been enduring. And so I was baptized in that Baptist church.
By the age of 8 years?
By the age of 8. My sexual abuse started at the age of 3, about between 3 and 4. And so at the age of 8, when it was continuing, I was ready to be saved from that. And I can remember going into the water that night and coming out and feeling clean, because that's what God does. He makes us clean. But the world has a way of reminding us or bringing that dirt back to us. And as a child, I didn't realize that Jesus was saving my eternity. And so because the abuse continued, I continued to be baptized. And by the age of 12, I was baptized 4 times in 3 different denominations. So, I was running the gamut. I was going to find the one that was going to work. And unfortunately, at the age of 12, when the abuse continued, I knew that I had a choice, that maybe God wasn't real, or worse than that for me was maybe he is real and he just doesn't love me.
Well, first of all, I'm so sorry that you endured that. I mean,
Thank
it's
you.
horrific. And it makes total sense that would be the conclusion you would come to. And I know, knowing a little bit of your story, it led you down a difficult path as well. Tell us a little of that.
Yes, sir. At the age of 12, when the baptisms in my mind hadn't worked, I felt worthless. And I often say that when you feel worthless, you act as if you have no worth. And so I had been taught at an early age that my body was not something to be treasured, that I was not something to be treasured. So I was pregnant with my first child by the age of 17. And at the age of 19, when I found myself pregnant again, terrified for my family to know, because they had stood by me through my first pregnancy, I began to hear a quiet voice that told me the only way to solve this issue was to go to an abortion clinic. It would take me almost 20 years before I would tell a soul about that day. And I can remember walking into the clinic that day, John, and looking across the street and seeing people holding signs. And what I needed that day more than anything was I needed somebody to come and hold me. I have never felt more alone. And when I left the clinic that afternoon, I remember thinking, well, you've done it now. Like, if he's real, he would never love someone like you. And that's how I lived my 20s. Married and divorced at a very young age. By the age of 23, I had 2 precious babies, and a failing belief that God was this good, loving God. I believed more of the scary God, the vengeful God, the one who would punish. When I would go to church, John, and they would talk about God as a loving father, that just didn't compute for me. My parents were divorced. My father was out of my life. Because of the divorce, we saw each other once a year, twice a year. My stepfather had some drug and alcohol issues, was very abusive due to hurts and pains in his own life. And so a loving father was not something that computed with me at all.
Wow.
And that would be how I would live through my 20s until I met and married the first Christian man that I had ever dated when I was 28 years old. And that's when my relationship with God actually started to change.
So I know, you told me your big question, like you literally would say, well, if God is real, if I ever see him, I'm going to ask him. And it's the question everybody asks, right?
Yes.
What was it?
I wanted to know, what kind of God are you? What kind of God would have allowed a 3-year-old to go through what I went through? And not only me, but 1 in 4 girls are sexually assaulted by the age of 18. I wanted to know, if you're so loving, where were you? And I really started to question him as a father when I became a mother.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that makes total sense. I mean, and I think that is why it is the number one question. And part of what drives people away from God the most probably is when, when we experience the evils of this world, and then we're like, okay, where are you if you love me so much? So all that changed, you said, the day you died. Why don't you take us to that day?
Sure.
What happened? Tell us why. What went on from there?
Sure. So my husband and I had been married for 5 years. We had just welcomed our twins, Willow and Micah, earlier that year. The twins were born 4 months early, and so I depict in my book just the struggle I really had with God during all of that, not knowing if our twins were going to survive. Was this punishment, for what I had done as a teenager? So I wrestled with all of that. And we came home with the twins after being in the hospital for about 4.5 months. And I just developed breathing issues, which later were diagnosed as just some anxiety. But at the time we didn't know.
I'm sorry. I don't mean to interrupt, but I've read your book, and you've got to tell,
okay. The babies.
You got to tell how many times you tested God and he comes through and still not enough. And
yes,
why?
because this is who I am. Right. And so I can remember trying to get pregnant with the twins, and I said, okay, God, I'll know you're real if we get pregnant. And so we went through IVF, and we got pregnant. And then I said, okay, well, I'll know you're real if it's twins. And so I think week 5, we had our ultrasound, and they started counting babies. And I can remember my husband, who's the most gorgeous black man, you'll ever see. And he turned as white as me and just said, please stop counting. And so they stopped at 2. And I remember going home that evening and going, no, this was a coincidence. I'll know you're real if it's a boy and a girl. And so we found out we were having a boy and a girl. And what was happening was I was setting up these hurdles for God to prove to me that he was real. But the problem is that if he was real, it didn't answer the biggest question that I had in my heart. And I was almost afraid for him to be real, John, because then it goes back to, where were you?
Right.
And so, sorry, gets me every time talking about my babies. And so I said, okay, I'll know you're real if one has blue eyes and one has green. My husband has dark brown eyes. It's recessive usually in the male genes. And so when the twins were born, they were born weighing 2 pounds each. We weren't sure that one or both would ever come home with us. And it was 12 days before we could hold them. And Virgil and I had actually quit praying on the exact same day. Virgil's prayer ended with, Father, your will be done. And my prayer ended with, I will hate you for the rest of my life if anything happens to my children. I mean, so clearly we're on 2 different spiritual. And so I held Micah that morning, and just for a second, he opened his eyes, and I held Willow later that evening, and she opened her eyes. And Micah has the most beautiful green eyes, or blue eyes, and Willow's eyes were green. I'm sorry. And I can remember just looking, and I have pictures of their eyes. I keep them on my computer to remind myself. But what happened in that moment was like,
so God answered your prayer, which by the way, just as a pastor, I wouldn't advise that.
Right. Right. I would say
but let me say this though. At the same time, I've also seen that God knows what we have gone through and meets us in ways that will speak to us to let us know that he does love us.
Yeah.
But I mean, it doesn't take away though that struggle, right? And that's what you still felt.
Yes. And it added so many questions. And I say that I had God right there, and I just let him slip through my fingers because I just allowed myself to believe that it was just coincidental, And so 6 months after we had gotten home from the hospital, my twins were 10 months old. I went in for a routine procedure, an endoscopy, where they'll put a tube and just to check for some breathing issues. And I woke up with acute pancreatitis. Everything that could have gone wrong in the procedure went wrong. And so they hospitalized me for a few days and said, this is all routine. You'll be here for 3 or 4 days on a pain pump, and then you'll go home. And I was about an hour away from my home, and I can remember waking up 2 days into the hospital stay. And I remember calling my mom and saying, please come be with me. And I remember saying, I'm dying. I'm dying. And I remember her saying, stop being so dramatic. I'll be there shortly. And so she got to the hospital. And a few hours after she was there with me, I went into respiratory arrest and coded. And so for me, the experience is so much different than what my mom experienced.
So your heart stopped beating?
Yes, everything. Yeah. My breathing stopped. My heart went out of rhythm. And what had happened was my body just could not filter the pain medication that I was receiving. And so it just sent me into respiratory arrest. And so I remember everything very vividly about that day. I remember opening my eyes and seeing my mom sit at the foot of my bed, and her back was towards me and she was reading a magazine. And I remember instantly knowing that my heart had just stopped, and I remember knowing I wasn't breathing. And I have been terrified of death my entire life. Like, biggest fear was death. How is it going to happen? When is it going to happen? Is it going to hurt? What's it going to be like? And instantly this peace overwhelmed me, comforted me, and there was no fear. And with the last little breath I had in my lungs, I said, "I love you," to my mom. And then I closed my eyes and instantly opened them and was standing in heaven. Every time I talk about it, it just takes me right back there. And so, I say that instantly I woke up in heaven.
Tell us a little bit of where were you? What did you see? What happened?
Sure. For me, everything happened simultaneously, but on earth we have to tell things in a sequence. And so I remember.
So you experienced time being different, and
yes, I experienced no time. Like that. I remember knowing that there was no rush. It was as if there was no time. Everything was flooded to me instantly. All knowledge, which I do try to remind my husband occasionally that at one point I actually did know everything. Thank you very much.
How's that go over?
All knowledge. He just laughs, but. All knowledge was downloaded instantly. I knew where I was. I knew who I was, which I say I was still Crystal. I was still the same Crystal that had just died in that hospital room that the doctors and nurses were performing CPR on to bring back. And yet I was the most perfect version of myself standing in this light. No negativity whatsoever was attached to me. And I can remember, go ahead.
I just wanted to mention, for some people listening, that what you just said is a commonality and something that the Apostle Paul, I think, writes about in 1 Corinthians 13. And as I mentioned, I think Paul had one of these near-death experiences that he recorded, Acts 14 and 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians 12. He talks about being taken up into heaven. And he says, in 1 Corinthians 13 that, right now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Mm-hmm. Then we will fully know just as we are fully known.
Yeah.
And it's like you said, you experience that.
Yes.
And Paul also says, though, that he heard things people are not allowed to tell, mm-hmm. which you've told me when you came back.
Yep.
You don't still have all that.
Right.
Which I'm sure Virgil uses to remind you with, right?
Yeah. And
you didn't get to keep that.
I remember all of the knowledge being flooded. I remember knowing that I was the same me that had existed. And I use the word, I say, I was the same me that existed for all of eternity. And I had some backlash from saying that. Mm-hmm. And I'd never read the Bible, John. I had grown up in church, but I had never read the Bible myself. And when I came across the verse that said, "For I've known you before I knitted you in your mother's womb," that is the me that was standing there. The me that he had created before I became the human form of myself. My spirit is what was standing in front of him.
And I
not
guess
my human.
Yeah, because I've heard you guys say that, and I was trying to piece it together with how does this fit with what the scripture says, but I thought about, well, if we are created in the image of God and come from the mind of God who created us before time, and you're experiencing God in a timelessness and connected to a knowledge and understanding, then it's just different than we experience ourselves now. We experience ourselves through time.
Yes. And that was what was so different about this experience was, here I teach my students about our 5 senses, but there it was as if I had 100 senses, 100 different ways to interact with the universe and the reality around me. And I remember knowing that was actually my reality. It was almost as if my earthly life is the dream state, and this heaven that I was standing in was actually my real reality, which gives me the sense of when people say they've gone home to be with the Lord. That's exactly what I mean by that was my reality. That was my home.
Mm-hmm.
I
wonder.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
wonder, and it has to do with something I'll explain, that my postulation or postulating what is this life is that the life we were created for, the eternal life we were created for, is 100x, and then we get put into this world and it goes down to 5
Yes.
senses, right?
Yes.
So it's actually a very limited experience, it seems to me, of both heaven and hell, like a temporal, time-bound experience of both.
Yes, very much so.
You
I
would
remember
agree?
feeling very free also, without the restraints of my physical body. I can just remember just feeling so light and free. And instantly, let me describe what I saw. Was I described myself as standing in a tunnel. But when we say tunnel, we think of like this darkness, but the entire tunnel was made of the most gorgeous light that I could ever describe. And not just a light that you could see, but a light that communicated, a light that I could feel, that I was connected with. And then I had 2 angels that were standing in front of me and to my left. And they didn't look to me like angels like I would depict with like big wings and halos. Actually, to me, I could see the silhouette. They were human-like, and the one on the left was a little bit taller than the one on the right. But what I saw was like almost if you look at a light bulb and you can see the outline of the light bulb, but you can't see what's in it because of the light radiating off of it. And so that's what I saw with the angels.
So there was
And
light coming out of them. Is that what you're saying?
yes, and what I would come to learn is that this light source that was running through me and around me and radiating off of the floors of this tunnel and radiating off of the angels was his source. It was God himself. And I remember instantly being so excited to see my angels.
How did you know they were angels?
Because I knew everything. Remember, I told you. I had no questions. I knew that I had known them, not on this life, not on this earth. I knew that I had known them for as long as I had been in existence. I use the term guardian angels because that's the closest I can really think of to explaining it. Is they were mine. These 2 that I met are only mine. They're not yours. You have your own. And I knew that they had been with me, through my entire journey. It's almost like when you go to take a class or something and they assign you a mentor, that kind of follows up and sticks with you. That's kind of like what they were for me here on earth. I just didn't know that they were there. And I remember that they were excited that I could finally see them and hear them. And I just remember loving them so much, John. Like they have to be my very best friends, like to love me and know me better than anybody on this earth does. And they were so excited. And we began to talk, but it was not with words. It was all through feelings and thoughts. And we stood there and just talked for what felt like the longest time. And I was just like rambling a mile a minute, trying to get everything out. You think I talk a lot as a human. Woo, you should have seen me when I didn't have to use words. And so just the way that we communicated was so vastly different from anything that I had ever imagined.
And so you're talking with them. And I think, again, for some of the things you say, and when I heard, I would initially go, wait a second, you knew them, for eternity. What does that mean? Because we come into existence, and but again, and I don't know, but is it that you are experiencing a timelessness, and so
Exactly.
we can only talk. The way I like to describe it, after listening to so many of you guys try to describe it, is that it's like trying to describe 3 dimensions to
Yes.
2-dimensional creatures.
Yes.
It's
I
like,
always say it's
well,
like
there's
trying to
this
speak
thing,
another language.
yeah, like that you can only go forward and back and side to side, and
Yes.
you're trying to explain, well, but there's an in and an out. There's
Yep.
an up and a down, and they're like, well, that makes no sense. Right.
That was the hardest part for me, John, was when I did come back, having that kind of communication and that kind of knowledge, and then coming back into my human form that could not express. Like my daughter to this day, she's 11 now, and she'll say, Mom, tell me again about the colors you saw. And I'd say, well, honey, I can't describe them because we don't have them here. Like she'll go, well, try to explain what it looked like. And I said, baby, there's no color on this earth that I could even compare. I mean, that's how hard it is to explain things.
Yeah, and I've talked about how it's, the colors of earth are the breakdown of the light spectrum of the sun, but the colors of heaven are the breakdown of the light spectrum of God.
Yes.
Yeah, of the glory
him.
of the glory and the light of God.
Yeah.
And so you said that was the light. Did you experience the presence of God?
I did. And so as I was speaking with the angels and we were talking, I became aware of a presence to my right, which I know had been there, but my awareness just came. And I turned to face this presence, and immediately my spirit recognized him. I say, like, I didn't meet God. I recognized him. And so this goes back to us talking about, well, how do you say you existed before you existed here? Well, I was standing in front of the entity that created me. Mm-hmm. I mean, can you imagine? And as soon as I faced, and I describe him as light, and there's another word that I wish that I had more detail, because it's not any kind of light we've ever seen here. But I saw him, and I fell straight to my knees. And I remember this is pivotal to me because I raised my hands. Now, I had been raised mostly Baptist and Methodist, and we didn't raise our hands in church. I had never praised like that. In fact, I was the person in church that when they'd play another song, I'd be like, okay, another song,
I know, some people talk about how, gosh, we'll just worship God forever in heaven. And I'll tell you, I mean, I know, even as a pastor, I'm like, oh, a church service forever. It's like, but yeah.
That's the funny part, is so you understand where I was, who I was. And I remember falling to my knees and putting my hands up, and then I couldn't even stay on my knees. I went straight down to my face, and it was out of a reverence. It was out of a love. And instantly, as I went down in front of him, I remember I just started crying, and he wrapped me in this tangible light, this tangible love that, I could feel. And I went back to, if God was real, let's just go back to walking out of the clinic that day at 19 years old. If God is real, I had some questions. One, what kind of God are you? Why are you so punishing? Why are you so vengeful? Where are you? I had become a mom of 4 children. How could you say that you love me and yet stand by? Why, while horrible atrocities were committed, to such an innocent child? And as I raised my hands and I opened my mouth, I said, why didn't I do more for you? And I'm so glad that God allowed me to remember that, John, because in that moment, with all that knowledge flooded into my spirit, and we talked earlier about, did I have a life review? I would call that my life review. That in an instance, the only question I had for him was one of regret. Why didn't I do more for you?
So that's probably confusing to people.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you got to go deeper into that. Mm-hmm. What do you mean? So what were you feeling? What were you seeing? What were you understanding that instead of you're saying instead of the question you had always said, if I could ask God,
Yeah.
I would, kind of,
Yeah.
why did you allow this? You ask a different question, but how did that
Why
come?
did I?
Yeah.
I think because, and I'll take you through the rest of the process, because like I said, I tell the story in a chronological order. However, it happened simultaneously, right? So I tell it in an order. So one of the reasons that most likely I said, why didn't I do more for you, was because all of the questions that I had were answered instantly. The minute that I arrived in my spirit form, I had no questions. You could have asked me how God was created. I think I might have been able to tell you, like any kind of question. So any of those questions that I held inside had already been answered to my spirit. However, I remember him not saying anything, but yet we were talking the entire time, again, with that communication without words. I remember being in awe of him. And here was the funny part. I remember reaching my hand out because I could not get close enough to him, and yet he was all around me. He had enveloped me with himself, almost as a cocoon, a blanket. And I remember as I was trying to get closer even, I said, I could worship you for all of eternity. Now, that is not something that Crystal would have ever said, because 4 songs in church and I was kind of done. And here I was saying, I could lay and worship you for all of eternity.
Well, and I think that's a great, it's a great point that's helped me understand what true worship is, because people say to me as a pastor, they'll say, what kind of egomaniac is God that he demands our worship? Well, it's not like that at all.
No,
it's more like, if you are so overwhelmed with joy and love and, like, what do you do with it? What do you do with it except kind of shout for joy? And it's more like that, right?
Yes. And that's exactly what it felt like. That's why I couldn't stay on my feet. I couldn't stay on my knees. I remember hearing the song, I Can Only Imagine, the first time that I had to come back, and the part where it said, will I stand in your presence, or to my knees will I fall? And I'm like, oh no, you go straight to your face. Like, I had just never I had never experienced such love, such goodness. And so I can remember in that instance, as I was laying there worshiping him, and talking, I looked down the end of this tunnel and I could see that at the very end, it became very bright. And like I said, I didn't really have any questions. I knew that that was the entrance to heaven. I didn't see any big gates. But once I noticed it, he said, once we get there, you can't come back. And he showed me in that moment my children, all 4 of my children. They were 13, 11. The twins were 10 months old.
So you were seeing your kids currently.
Yes, current.
And the end of that tunnel. So I talk about there, a border or a boundary that we, on. Did you have any sense of what that was?
I just knew that once I crossed it, that's when I noticed it, and I knew that that was the entrance to heaven. Which people say, well, then why do you say you were in heaven? And I was like, well, I don't know what to call this place. It was with God, and to me, that's heaven.
And I do think that's I don't really have the answer after studying 1,000 of these cases, that because sometimes God, one person I interviewed a couple weeks ago said, Jesus told her, you haven't died yet, but clinically, she was dead, right? And so what is this? And, I kind of postulate that it is something in between, and that crossing over. And importantly, I think it's why we can't say we know what the afterlife is like just from near-death experiences.
Right.
That's really where we have to go to, well, what has God revealed through history, through Jesus? Because you guys are validating the God of Jesus, right? I mean, is that who you experienced?
And that's what I tell people is, they'll say, but you didn't see Jesus. And I said, I didn't see him in his human form, but the way that I explain it, my husband explained the Trinity to me years ago. And it's the only way I've ever been able to explain what I experienced is is that if you're holding an egg, you're holding one egg, but it's made up of 3 separate parts. But yet all 3 parts are their own entity, and yet they create the one egg. And so to me, that was what I experienced. I experienced the Trinity. I was raised a Christian. I absolutely believe that Jesus was who he said he was. And when I go back and read his words, the God that he speaks about is the God that I met. And so, no, I didn't see him in his human form, but I interchange God and Jesus a lot when I tell my story.
So go back. You were saying, so God says to you, you can't go beyond that and still go back. And then why did he show you your kids?
So as soon as I saw the entrance, the end of this tunnel that we were in, he said, once we get there, you can't go back. He showed me my children. And in that instance, he reminded me of a time when I was sitting in church, and because I went to church my whole life, right? I just didn't believe anything that they were saying. So
that's not Austin.
Crazy?
I guess that's Oklahoma.
Yeah, it was, like I said, it wasn't.
I have a hard enough time.
Church.
I have a hard enough time getting people who do believe to come to church,
you know,
much less those who don't.
I know. And here's the thing, like, they did an interview years ago on 700 Club, and Pat Robinson called me a former atheist. And honestly, I've always known he was real. What I doubted was that he was good enough to love me, right? And so really that was my struggle through church. So he reminded me of a time that nobody else knew about, where our pastor was talking about that we are to love God above all else, that we are to love God more than anything. And I remember in my head telling God, if you're real, I'd never love you more than my kids. And you think about, and remember I said becoming a mom was really what also sparked my struggle with God, because here I've experienced what it feels like to have a child, and just the lengths that you would go to, that you would lay your life down, for them. And so he showed me that the plan for their life, all of their lives, was perfect. So I say that here, and it doesn't make any sense, because the plan that he has for each of our lives is perfect. But what he showed me was that his perfection does not mean that we will not have sorrow and hurt and tribulations, and that things will not be done to hurt us. His perfection is that in the end, no matter what, he takes it all and uses it for good, for his glory. And that's something that we will never understand until we are standing with him again, in eternity.
But you saw that, you experienced that,
yes.
And that
I did.
sense of...
I experienced it through the life of my 4 children. And something very pivotal that I remember was I knew that I was not truly leaving them, which I think that this is really important for anybody that's watching that has lost someone that they are very close to, or a parent who's lost a child or a spouse. But I knew that I was not really leaving my kids. I knew that I was leaving them physically, but that I was going to experience every moment of their lives with them, almost more so in a way. I knew that I wasn't going to miss a thing, and I knew that I was going to see them again. And so people have said, well, how do you know you were going to see them again? How do you know that they were going, to even go to heaven? And I said, well, because God told me. I don't know what else to say. Both my older kids had a relationship with the Lord. My babies were babies. All I know is that God told me we were all going to be together again.
Well, and some might hear that almost like there's no free will. Mm-hmm. But you told me you experienced something different even with that. Talk about that.
Yes. And so in that moment, he said, you can go back and be their mom, or you can continue with me. And I remember looking at my kids, and I remember looking at him, and I said, I want to go with you. And so that was the first time in my entire life that I truly chose God above all else. Like, I know what that feels like. Now, when I came back, John, and told that story, my older kids were like, wait, what? Like, you chose
hey,
not
wait
to
a second.
come back? Yeah. And
Mom.
so I've explained I mean, just the love that we have for him, John, it surpasses the love you have for your children, your grandchild. Can you imagine loving something more than her?
Well,
Oh,
I think what I have come to realize over the years is that all the love I have for my children, for my
mhm.
wife, is derivative. In
Yep,
other words, I have nothing, I have no love. Love comes from God.
yep, it
So
does.
I'm just getting to taste a little bit
Yep.
of what real love is. And so that's what you're,
Yes.
and I've probably come to that because I've heard so many of you
Yeah.
tell that, and it's all right in the Bible, right?
Mhm. Yeah,
But somehow it's hard to grasp.
it is. It is, because we go back to the free will. And so um, instantly the vision of my kids was gone. We continued towards the entry point into the heaven realm. God walking on my right, my angels to my left, up ahead of me. And the entire time, God and I are just like talking. I mean, just everything.
What are you talking about?
I don't remember. But we never stopped. And like
But
people that
see,
know me go, that sounds familiar. Like she never stops talking. So
okay, so I have a question, because were you getting new information and knowledge as you were going on talking?
I mean, we spoke the entire time, like the entire time. But remember, I really didn't have any questions because I knew it all. Like,
Well, and again, I think it's so hard to, because I've struggled as a pastor with
mhm.
some of you guys saying that, because I'm like, well, only God knows everything.
I knew everything I
Eh,
needed to know.
Well, and I think that's
Yeah,
what I've come to conclude is
yeah,
like, because I've also heard people keep talking about, well, you keep learning.
yeah.
Like, because there's, I mean, the exploration of
Oh,
heaven
yeah.
and God's creation. You didn't know yet what
No,
you hadn't seen, and yet there's still
right.
stuff to see.
Yes. And when I say
But
I know everything, that's what I knew everything to the capacity that Crystal needed to know, that questions that Crystal had, you know?
well, and that's why I think it does tie right into what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13, that we will, know fully as we're
Yeah.
fully known. It's like
Yeah.
all those questions. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we continued to walk towards the end of the tunnel. And as we got closer, I noticed this little girl up in front of me. And she was so different than anything that I had seen in this realm. She was fully human. And I would say she was 3 or 4. She wore this white, like frilly dress with little yellow flowers, and the yellow from the flowers would prism, with him, with his light all around. And she had this little basket, and she would dip it into the light and then dump the basket out, and the light would just cascade like water. And the thing that got me though is that she would throw her little head back and just laugh this laugh. And I remember instantly knowing, like, she's mine. Like if you're going to stake claims to something, like that, she's mine. And I remember loving this child so much. And I started just trying to get to her as fast as I could. And the whole time I'm just watching her play and smile. And something started to happen to my spirit. I started to, it was almost as if my spirit was being blown up like a balloon, but with love. Like I've never felt love like this. And as I got close to her, I remember saying out loud, I'm going to explode, because I could not take one more bit of love for her. And I was okay with exploding into a million pieces because I couldn't take my eyes off of her. And I remember right before I scooped her up, I just wanted to scoop her up in my arms and tell her how much I loved her and how precious she was and valuable she was and how perfect she was. And right before I got to that point, it was almost like I was wearing glasses, and God removed the way that I was viewing her from me. And I stopped and I looked back down at her, and I recognized her immediately. And I recognized her as me. And in an instance, everything, God explained everything. He said, I have tried to tell you this your entire life. I have tried to show you your entire life. It was one thing
Show
for
you
God to
what? What was
say,
he?
I love you. but he allowed me to view myself through his eyes. Because at the age of 3 and 4, when the sexual abuse began, when the evil came in, and all through those years until I was 12, when I would call out to him and say, where are you? And then the main question, like, if you loved me so much, why would you let that happen? And what he showed me in that moment was that he does not interfere with the free will that he has given humans. That he was with me when I called out, that every moment of my life, he never left. When I was in that dark room every Thursday night, he was there. I had felt alone my entire life, but to know that this God, who could have not even looked upon what was happening to me, not only looked upon it, but sat with me, so that when I went through this earthly pain at the hands of another human, that I did not do so alone. And
I
the
mean,
other thing, I'm sorry, John.
well, I think people might be thinking like, well, so what? You still went through it. How did
Right.
that help?
Because I don't know exactly how he, word for word, how he explained it to me, but he explained how he gave humans the gift of free will. And if he interferes to help me, then he's also interfering in another human's free will. Whether our free will is not just for us to do good things, we do not so great things because of our free will. And if he interferes with that free will, then we become nothing more than puppets, And so what he explained to me was that I was not hurt at the hands of an unloving God. I was hurt at the hands of a human that was experiencing, or dictating through their own free will.
Well, and going against God's will.
Yes, exactly. And that was the other thing, is that free will and God's will, our ways and his ways, they're so different. That's why the perfection, when I say, he said that he showed me our lives are perfect. If you would have told me that before I experienced him, I would have had a lot of things to ask you, what's so perfect about this happening or that? But what he did in that moment was he freed me from a lifetime of shame, because a lot of victims, especially of childhood, sexual abuse, you take it on. It became to me a part of my identity. It became a darkness, a voice constantly in my mind telling me how worthless I was. I deserved it. I was bad. Something was wrong with me. And what he did in that moment, John, was something that therapy had never been able to do for me. And he healed me. He freed me from the inside out.
In what way? And
in the way that bad things can continue to happen in my life, but what they cannot do any longer is take away the belief and the knowledge that I know that God is a loving God, that he is a loving Father. That was the thing I wrestled with my entire life, John, was, if you're such a good, loving Father, how can you, or where are you? And he showed me, I'm with you.
And so that healed your sense of identity,
very much so.
And the shame that went along with the abuse that you realized was not his will.
Right.
It's why I'm I often remind, and even during this series, the application of this series is Jesus taught us to pray, Father in heaven, holy is your name, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, meaning his will is not done on earth, not unless we choose to be the conduits through which it can be done.
Yes, I completely agree.
And that he gives us free will so that we can love God. You can't love without free will. You can't force love.
Right. And that was the other thing that brings me to this is, so growing up, I love Jesus, right? I wanted to know everything about him. God scared me, literally scared me to death. I viewed him as angry, vengeful, judgmental, very terrified of him.
So
So
you meaning you separated God and Jesus
yeah,
in
yeah, as a
in your
child,
mind. Okay.
God scared me. Jesus was somebody I wanted. Um, Without that free will, I would not have been able to choose him on my own account. People often will say, why do we face so much, evil or darkness here? How do we recognize or be able to choose God without like the yin and the yang, like
Well, without our ability to,
right.
you can't
You have to have a
freely
choice.
you can't freely choose to love someone if you can also freely choose not to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what I remember. That's what I take out of this whole process is what he reminds me of is that I do love him. And, in that moment, I remember, and somebody said to me, they said, I just knew when I was reading your book, I just knew that God brought you to heaven to meet your child. And as much as I can't wait to hold that child and scoop that child up and tell them how much they're loved, I just look at people and say, no, God brought me to heaven to meet his. So I had no idea that I was his, that I belonged to him. And that's something that we have to hold on to. And I'll just touch really briefly, but 10 years later, life goes on and me having this experience does not make life perfect. When 2 years ago, when my husband, who suffers from PTSD and is an Army veteran, tried to take his own life, you talk about calling out to God and saying, where are you? I know he's there. I know he's good. And I still wrestle, so when we know
But I
God,
think
it doesn't make our lives perfect.
that's actually very encouraging because it helps people realize that even though you've had this experience, when you're back in this world where God's will is not done and it is veiled, and I personally think that what we are going through is a limited experience of what we were created for, but we are experiencing a taste of heaven and a taste of
Yes,
hell
of
because
both.
now is the time of choosing. And
Yes,
our free will and our choices do matter.
yes.
But the whole message of Jesus is God so loved every one of us that Jesus came and paid for all our wrongs.
Yep.
Yes, we do wrongs. But God loves us so much, he made it so simple that any who want him and turn back and, really truly want his forgiveness, heaven's a gift. And did you experience, that's what you experienced?
Very much so. I touch on a couple of points in the book. Right before I died, we were going through a lawsuit with somebody who had a business deal that had gone wrong, had left, a significant amount of money on us to pay. So we were in the middle of lawsuits. When I came out of my experience, the first thing I told my husband was to drop the lawsuit, that we would pay the debt. And so Virgil say, okay, that's when I knew, like, she was telling the truth, because I was a very selfish human being. The other thing that changed was I harbored no hatred in my heart for the people who had hurt me. In fact, I began to pray for these people because I cannot fathom even my worst enemy, the person who's hurt me. I don't really have any enemies anymore, just the person who's hurt me the most. I want that person to experience the eternity of God. Like, that's how life-changing he is.
I guess because you realize he is what's missing.
And he is love. Like, I never understood that until I met him, until I stood there. Everything through him, like you were saying, we can love. I love because you first loved me. That his love funnels through us. I've never touched love. I felt love, but on this earth, I've never touched it. But with him, I touched the face of love. And it's just, I can't even imagine one person not getting to experience that.
So Crystal, we need to wrap up, but as a wife and a mother of 4 kids, and here we are, in the midst of coronavirus, a life where things don't always go right. What would you say to parents today?
The number one thing that I hold on to is that I don't have the right words, but that he is with us. even when we feel, John, that he's not, even when we feel completely alone, he's with us. And more than anything, he is in the midst of all of this, and that he loves us more than we could ever comprehend. But the biggest thing that I take away from him is that this is not it. This is just our beginning. Like, the best is yet to come.
Well, that's a great way to wrap it up. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. Really, really appreciate it, Crystal.
Thank you, John.
Blessings.
Well, I hope you were inspired by this Imagine Heaven Live series interview with Crystal McVea. Her story is both incredibly tragic, but also incredibly inspiring, because we all have those questions. And even though we might not have the full answer on this side of eternity, to hear others, and I've heard many like her say, in God's presence, it all made sense. Now, how it all made sense, I still can't put it all together. And yet what we can know for sure is that God does not do those evil, horrible things, but he does allow us to have a free will. And one day he will bring justice, and to all who turn to him, he'll bring redemption. So I hope that inspires you, like Crystal, to live with forgiveness and to live bringing God's love and goodness to the world, because that's what's needed to combat evil. Well, if you want to dive deeper into near-death experiences and the Bible and how they relate, you can read Imagine Heaven or Imagine the God of Heaven, or go check out the Imagine Heaven podcast. And until next time, be blessed.